All right. Well, welcome to today's session about Sisense authentication and single sign-on. My name is Ashton Walden, and I am a technical account manager over here at Sisense. So I work with our customers to help them get the most out of the product that they can. So translating their business requirements into actual solutions. And one of the topics that typically comes up both in prospect conversations and conversations with our customers is the topic of authentication and specifically single sign-on. There's kind of a lot of confusion, I think, around how it works and what it is. And there's 4 different methods of single sign-on. So my goal here today is to go over what single sign-on is, a high level of how it works, the 4 supportive methods that we have in Sisense, and when you should use each of them. So which methods can be best for you for your specific use case. Here's the high-level agenda. So we'll go over some of the basics of kind of all of the authentication methods. They're all very, very similar. Then we'll kind of split this out into two parts. One is single sign-on for internal use cases, which will be kind of the SAML 2.0 and OpenID Connect piece of this. And then we'll go into external and OEM use cases with JWT and web access tokens. Then I'll show you guys kind of the giant decision matrix of how you can pick between all of these different methods. We could go over a couple of real-world applications, and then at the end, if you guys have any questions, we'll do some Q&A. But since you guys are able to unmute and whatnot, if I say anything that doesn't make sense, feel free to jump in and ask your question. So to start off, and I promise this will be the nerdiest part of the presentation, right at the front, is a quick conversation around the actual flow and the 2 types of SSO authentication flow, which is your front channel flow and your back channel flow. Front channel is what most of our methods are using. So our SAML, JWT, and web access tokens. And then back channel, OpenID Connect is always back channel. And then SAML, some SAML providers support a back channel flow, but a lot of them don't. So SAML is typically front end. And the main difference here is if you take a look at the diagram on the left, we have 3 boxes here. We have SP, UA, and IDP. So the UA is the user, the SP is the service provider. So in our context here, that'll be Sisense. And then IDP is your identity provider, which would be like your Okta or potentially even your product if you're using JWT. So when a user tries to request a resource from the service provider is going to go redirect to the identity provider, where the identity provider will then go create a signed assertion using some sort of key that both the identity provider and the service provider have agreed on to sign an assertion, which will then be redirected back to the service provider, letting the service provider know the information about the user and ultimately probably landing a cookie in that user's browser. So the main kind of theme here with the front channel is all of the communication between the identity provider and the service provider are happening through the user's browser itself. So that's why there's all these redirects happening. The identity provider and the service provider don't ever talk directly. And that's the benefit of your back channel auth flow, where you'll see the user tries to make a request from the service provider. That's that first line. The service provider is going to redirect to the SSO service with a little bit of information about the initial request that the user was trying to make to the service provider. And then the identity provider is going to talk directly to, you can see that back channel box down there, is going to talk directly to the back channel. The identity provider is then going to redirect back to the service provider with a little bit of information about itself, where then the back channel is able to allow the service provider and the identity provider to talk without the user's browser in the middle. So they're making requests directly to each other. So there's no man in the middle. So there's no potential that the user could do anything nefarious, intercept the assertions or the payloads that are going back and forth and modifying them. It would be incredibly difficult to modify them in the front channel flow. But if you ever got access to the way that those assertions were being signed, you could theoretically create your own tokens to log yourself in as anybody with those systems. So that's kind of the pros and cons, or I guess only really the cons of front channel, but that's the main difference between the 2 authentication flows. And again, most of the authentication that we'll be talking about today is front channel, whereas OpenID Connect is your back channel flow here. So yeah, let's go quickly. I want to quickly go over kind of the differences between SAML and OpenID Connect. and then JWT. And then I'll actually show you how they work. So both SAML and OpenID Connect are standards for authenticating and authorizing users. And this is where we get a lot of our questions, both pre and post sales. Our customers will ask us, hey, do you work with Okta? Do you work with Auth0? Do you work with Ping1 or OneLogin? And the answer is, if they support SAML 2.0 or OpenID Connect, we support them because, again, they're standards. So most identity providers will, at the very least, be supporting SAML 2.0. OpenID is a relatively newer protocol. It's not new, but all of them will almost 100% of the time implement SAML 2.0, and then some of them will have OpenID Connect. And you can often just pick which one you want to use. So within something like Okta, when you're setting up a service provider like Sisense, you can either get the SAML 2.0 configuration to go plug into Sisense, or the OpenID Connect configuration to plug into Sisense, and they're going to be cosmetically the same to your end user with how they log in. And I would say that the use of these makes the most sense with internal use cases. So when you're kind of creating dashboards and sharing analytics within your own company, as everybody within your company is going to kind of be on the same identity provider. Whereas with our OEM use cases, it's possible that your customers might all be on different identity providers, and getting those all to channel through the same identity provider to talk to Sisense might be a bit tricky. As well as, and we'll talk about this in a second with JWT. JWT is really easy to implement. So if you wanted to home grow really quickly your own identity provider for Sisense, JWT will take you less than 10 lines of Python code, if like Flask code, whereas writing something like SAML or OpenID Connect will take you a while, as they're pretty strict protocols. And I will even show that here in a second on kind of the main difference. So that's kind of why I draw the line that OpenID Connect and SAML are going to be your best use case for internal, whereas JWT is almost always going to be for OEM and external use cases, because it's not necessarily a standard. They're vendor specific. A JWT just stands for JSON Web Token. And you can see here, I've decoded one of my Sisense JWT tokens here, where all it contains is basically that subline, which is my email, a Unix timestamp, that IAT, which is when it was created, and then a random JTI, so that's a random string that prevents replay attacks. But that payload can be any JSON. So if your identity provider says, hey, we have JWT, it's possible that some of your fields may align with our fields. So IAT almost always means initiated at. In the JWT world, sub almost always means the subject, right? But anything further than that, like your IDP may not actually be sending to us. But again, it's very, very easy to construct and implement. So with use cases where your users, if this is an OEM use case, are already authenticated within your own product, let's say you're selling like a SaaS app, like an e-commerce app or something, and your users have already logged in to your application, Sisense can treat your application as the identity provider now, because you've already authenticated the user. So you could implement very easily a JWT handler on your side to simply forward on the user information, since again, you've already authenticated them. So it's a very, very good fit for OEM scenarios, because then you don't have to be mirroring your customer's single sign-on settings in Sisense as well, which would lead to a huge maintenance nightmare of having all of their config living within your site and within Sisense. As well as web access tokens is ideal for OEM use cases in view-only scenarios. So the main difference between JWT and web access tokens is web access tokens allow for the actual user definition to be passed in the token itself. So it allows for anonymous user creation. So if you wanted to share a dashboard with very, very specific data security rules, kind of globally to everybody in the world for a day, you could create a JWT or a web access token that says that would allow anybody with access to that token to access those specific resources for a scope amount of time. And I'll show an example of that here in a bit if that doesn't make sense. And I think at that point, what I'd like to do is we'll pause for questions. And while we're paused, I'm going to pull up my kind of demo where we can go through these 4 methods, and I can show you maybe a little bit more live how they work if there's anything that doesn't make sense. Cool. No questions. So what I'm going to do is we're now going to kind of go through each of the different flows so that they make a little bit more sense here. So I have set up, or I guess maybe we just go through the config within Sisense, and then I can show you how they each work. So within the actual single sign-on method or menu here in Sisense, you can see 3 out of the 4 authentication methods, as these pertain to named users and are technically actually single sign-on. Whereas your web access tokens are going to live within this web access tokens menu here. And this is where that kind of front versus back channel conversation comes back into play, as well as the different types of cryptography that they're using. So you'll notice that JWT, we have this shared secret down here. So this is what's actually being used by your JWT handler to go sign a payload. And then Sisense is also using this secret to verify the payload, to verify the authenticity of the assertion that was sent over to Sisense. So this is how we're able to not just let anybody generate a JWT token. It has to be only people that have the shared secret. This is a symmetrical key, essentially. So the same token is used to sign and verify, whereas something like SAML is using a public X509 certificate. So this public key is used to sign your SAML, or sorry, this is used to verify your SAML assertions, whereas there's going to be a private key that exists on your identity provider side that is signing it. So it makes it a little bit harder to sign the tokens. Not any admin that has access into your Sisense portal could go copy this 509 certificate and start signing their own tokens. And then OpenID Connect, in a very similar vein, has a client secret that is what will be used on the back channel to kind of send back and forth payloads, as well as I think on the front channel. Clear as mud. All makes sense. So I'm going to go ahead and save my settings here, and we'll quickly go through the JWT flow. So if you remember back to that diagram, if I go and try to access that webinar site, since I am not authenticated, it's going to go redirect to that remote login URL that was set in my browser, or sorry, that was set in my Sisense. And now it is the job of my identity provider to actually go ahead and sign a assertion to go let Sisense know who is trying to sign it. So I've created this little UI where you can go, where Sisense employees at least can go and fill in their own JWT tokens to go pass along to Sisense. So you can see we can generate one here. But again, these tokens have to be signed with that shared secret to create this payload here. And there's something else that I wanted to mention too. Oh, with this actual flow, somebody doesn't necessarily have to go try to access a Sisense resource to kick it off. You could simply, within your application, send this as your URL. I can even copy paste this into a new browser, and this will sign somebody in. So you could inject a JWT on the fly to log somebody in to Sisense without them having to go through a bunch of redirects. This would just log them in directly into Sisense. And it's mad because I just passed the same token twice. So again, there was that JTI that prevents replay attacks. So this is saying, hey, that JTI has already been used. So you would have to generate a new one. So again, that was all kind of happening on the front end. Again, this remote login URL, this is what I would say is a purely cosmetic URL. That is just a place that we're going to redirect the user to if they're not logged in. But the user doesn't necessarily have to go try to access a resource from Sisense to actually, kick off this flow. You can kick it off from your side. Same with SAML. So with SAML, these are also cosmetic URLs. And when I go to log out, we'll see why SAML is a little bit more complicated. Because SAML is sending these very strictly structured XML payloads back and forth on login and logout. So when I go to try and access that webinar site again, we'll see that Sisense sends over this information here saying, hey, somebody is trying to log in to Sisense. And if they're allowed to, here's where you should log them back to. Here's where you should send the or this is where you should send the SAML assertion back to. But again, way higher structured. This would be a little bit harder to implement yourself, which is why we would recommend just using the JWT method, as they're both front channel. They both have the relatively same amount of security involved with them. And then the actual signing process of the SAML assertions is way more complicated than the JWT. So if you remember the JWT, the payload was very tiny, and the actual signing of it was very tiny. In SAML, this is what the payload looks like. So instead of having an initiated time, a subject, and then a nonce, so like a one-time value to prevent replay attacks, we have embedded within the payload the actual signature of the payload using the X59 certificate. We've got the subject of it, some information about the subject, so you can see my first and last name in here. And it all has to be formatted like this. SAML is very strict. Your identity providers have won't have a tough time doing this at all. This is what Okta and OneLogin and all those providers do all the time. But you would be in a lot of hurt trying to implement this yourself if all you were trying to do was forward on your authentication information to Sisense. And then in the same way as JWT, the object just needs to be base64 encoded and forwarded to Sisense, where then Sisense is going to use that X509 key to validate the signature and forward everything on. And then finally, we have the OpenID Connect method here, where there's a little bit more information that we have to give Sisense, because again, it's going to be using a bunch of back channel calls. So it's going to be talking to the identity provider itself without the browser's knowledge. So we have to tell it where it's going to be talking to get information about the user, and how to actually kick off some of the flow here. So if I try to sign in again, we will see that Sisense sends over some information in the URL parameters here. These are those parameters. So we're saying, hey, somebody's trying to log in. Here's a token to identify the potential session that we're trying to create. Essentially, it's kind of these two groups together. The OpenID provider is then going to send back an authorization code to Sisense, which the identity provider on its side has associated this authorization code with my email. So it knows when Sisense is trying to talk to my identity provider that they're both talking about me. And then that information needs to be sent to Sisense. Now, the reason this failed is I took too long. So Sisense kicks off this flow, and if you take too long, it's going to reject it. So we just have to go through it fast, and then I can show you the backend calls. And sometimes I'm just way too slow. So I might just be being too slow today. So I'm going to do app accounts. Oh, my screen sharing stopped. Get that back up. How long was the screen gone, you guys?
Not very long.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, just a couple seconds.
All right. Anyway, that flow would finish. And then the back end calls will happen a bunch. Again, this isn't really information that you need to know. It's just kind of cool to know how the back and forth work. There's a great video by Okta that actually goes a little bit more in depth on the exact calls that are being made if you're confused about the exact order of events or how it's secure and why it's a little bit more secure than the front channel calls. But that is that. Let me pull back open my my slides here. So this all brings me back to the decision matrix here. And is this still sharing the presentation? Yes. I've kind of we didn't go over web access tokens. So the last one here is web access tokens. My apologies there. Which again, as I was saying, allow for anonymous user access. So if I go over to this JWT.io page, I already have generated a web access token that we can take a look at. Oh, actually, we can't because it's signed. But I do have the payload if we want to take a look at it. So this is what I was talking about with the user information being able to be defined within the payload itself, where we have a base subject that is kind of the user that we're going to be basing all of our data security rules, kind of like all the defaults for this anonymous user off of. We've got a couple of different timestamps that specify the scope in which this token is allowed to be used. So the token that I'm generating here will expire at the end of this webinar. And then the resources that the user is allowed to access, the different permissions that they have access to. So are they allowed to modify filters? Are they allowed to export data out of these dashboards? And then all you have to do, and I can throw this in the chat if you guys want to validate it as well, is go to the link with that web access token in the URL. And now your user is anonymously logged in and able to see just the resources scoped to the exact data security rules that you wanted them to see within Sisense. And the way that this works too is almost like, trying to think of a good analogy this morning on this, but it's almost like a restaurant, where a restaurant might close at 9, but if you showed up at 8:30 and you were still eating, they'd let you stay a little bit longer, because they're going to be cleaning up the kitchen and whatnot. So this token, in the same way that in the front-end flow, there was an exchange of tokens and then a cookie was ultimately put in the user's browser. With this one, this initial web access token that we sent over to Sisense is being exchanged with something else that allows the user to stay longer. So if the expiration on this token was set for 10 seconds, as long as I initiated the handshake within 10 seconds, I can access this dashboard basically indefinitely unless the session's killed from the Sisense side. Which is why this option can be kind of nice for view-only use cases, is you can kind of on the fly, in a very cheap fashion, generate these web access tokens with a short expiration, so there's no risk of them getting leaked out and people accessing things that they shouldn't, where you can basically grant one of these web access tokens to a user and they can redeem it very, very quickly to get access to a very specific set of resources. So that is web access tokens. So anonymous user provisioning. So the kind of hierarchy here between all of the different options is the only one that we really need to talk about is probably the ideal use cases and the implementation complexity. So if you were to try to implement SAML or OpenID Connect yourself, that's going to take a really long time. I'm not really sure it's worth the effort unless there's a very specific use case around it. Whereas your JBT and your web access tokens, if you're trying to implement, and when I say implement, I mean coding yourself, they're going to be very, very easy. You can do it in, like I said, probably less than 10 lines of Python code. And the real split is between internal and OEM use cases. So your SAML and your OpenID Connect, those are going to be great if this is just internal. We're authenticating your peers or your employees within a single identity provider, whereas JWT and web access tokens are going to be great for the external. I've never seen a filter like the one in web access token. Oh, like the permissions? Or I guess I can get to that in a second. There is a circumstance that I will note with SAML and OpenID Connect that might make sense for an OEM use case if you're using something like Auth0 or Okta External for authenticating your customers. As long as all of your customers are kind of being routed through one authentication system, as well as your internal employees, SAML and OpenID Connect can work. Again, if you're using a service like Auth0 or Okta External, but if you're authenticating your users using your own kind of system within your product, you're going to be in a better situation to just forward that information on with JWT. And then, yeah, for some real world applications, like I was saying, you've got your JWT and web access tokens for your OEM. So JWT would be great for embedding a dashboard design experience where a user needs to be tied. You need to have like a designer user, so a named user within the product. Whereas web access tokens could be great for something that's using Sisense.js or Compose SDK, and we're just displaying analytics within a website that are view only. So any view only use cases there. or if you wanted to share some analytics globally, so putting something on your homepage. And then both OpenID Connect and SAML for internal, like I was just saying, users are accessing Sisense through a single sign-on card. And the reason that I put them kind of next to each other is it's almost indistinguishable which one you're using. So do whichever one your IDPs support. So if it just supports SAML, do SAML. OpenID Connect, like I said, is going to be a little bit more secure. So you might lean towards that, but both will work just fine. They wanted me to plug our survey at the end of this, so let me know how I did. Please take the survey and give us some feedback on maybe some topics you want to see on these webinars. And I will pop over to the Q&A. So I see from one of the participants, they asked, I've never seen a filter like the one in the web access token example dashboard. Is this something from a newer version of Sisense or something? If I pull open the web access token docs, let me grab that. If I paste that payload back into here. Oops. The permissions here. I think that they've always been in the product. Let's see. Oh, the filter on the dashboard for category. Oh, like over here? On the right side panel. Oh, like this. Yeah, so this filter pop-up, I don't know if I pulled this up, but this is our newer filter dialog, if that's what you're asking about.
I think that's just a UI. It's a checkbox for the old versus new UI, correct? For the
yeah.
UI. Yeah.
So that'll be in. I want to say looking. I don't remember where they would put it actually, but it's not in the secret menus. But yeah, if you're not seeing it within your own Sisense, you might not be updated enough. I want to say that we released this in 23.3. That sounds right-ish. It was a version this year that we released, but if it's not on, we can help you get it turned on. I guess any other questions from the group on single sign-on?
Oh, I have a question actually.
Yeah.
I use JWT after someone like accesses Sisense through my embedded frame. Let's say I had like a really short Sisense session, so they might leave their browser open overnight and like in the next morning they reopen their window and their session's no longer valid. Like, how would I retrieve the Sisense session or cookie or whatever on my web page to then like check it in the morning and say, oh, it's invalid, like it's out of date or whatever. Like, the cookie I'm looking for is not the one I stored, so I should refresh your page or something.
You shouldn't have to. So if a user is on a page, and I might be able to even kick it off here. Let me pop open. It probably doesn't matter. So if I'm on this page, and something kills my session, which something killing my session could be the cookie, my browser cookie dying. The moment that I try to navigate to anything, it's going to kick me back to that JWT handler or your single sign-on handler. So it should redo that whole flow kind of automatically. It's just going to hit your JWT point again, unless, are you saying that you're passing your token directly to Sisense and you don't necessarily have?
I do, yeah.
Got it. And do you have a remote login set up?
No.
Got it. Yeah, so the best way to do that would likely be getting a remote login set up. That when a user tries to hit it, let me just swap this back to JWT. When somebody tries to hit that remote login URL, it's going to go look within your own product cookies to go figure out who the user is and then recreate a token for it. That's probably the easiest way to do it. The other way would probably be using some sort of browser side REST API calls to check if they're authenticated, and if not, sending the token again.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Cool. Well, if there's no other questions, the recording will be available. I'm not sure when, but it will be uploaded to academy.sisense.com /page/webinars, as well as I think to the Sisense YouTube channel. And yeah, definitely let us know in the survey what you thought and what topics you want us to go over in the future. But with that, I think I will wrap this up.